Welcome to the upper digestive system. In this tutorial, we'll focus on the histology and organization of the stomach. I'm Dr. Catherine Moore, and I'm the histology wizard. We continue to move down the digestive tube from the esophagus to the stomach, which is a greatly dilated segment of the digestive tract that functions to continue digestion of carbohydrates, begin digestion of triglycerides and proteins, and mix the ingested food into a mass called chyme. Although we won't go into great detail here, you should note that the control of stomach function occurs via three major mechanisms. Neural mechanisms, where stretch receptors sense the fullness of the stomach and act locally on the myenteric plexus, as well as via longer reflexes involving the CNS, that provide a higher level of control of digestive and glandular activities. Hormones are released by endocrine cells in the digestive tract, and they act to control secretion of buffers, acids, and enzymes, and we'll talk a lot about these as we proceed through each region. Local mechanisms such as pH, physical, and chemical stimulation will also act to control both hormone release and secretion of other factors. The stomach technically consists of four major regions: the cardia, which is a narrow transitional zone between the esophagus and the stomach; the body and the fundus, which comprise the majority of the stomach. Since these are histologically identical, we will consider them as one region. And finally, we have the pylorus, the funnel-shaped region that opens into the duodenum of the small intestine. Let's quickly review the general plan of the stomach before focusing on each individual region. In this cartoon, you can easily distinguish the layers and sublayers of the stomach: the mucosa, the submucosa, the Muscularis externa, and the serosa. Note that all stomach regions contain the four layers. The submucosa and mucosa of the stomach have large longitudinal folds called rugae that flatten when the stomach fills with food. Here we have a familiar H&E section of the body of the stomach, showing the mucosa with its epithelium, lamina propria, and Muscularis mucosa. We will spend most of our time today talking about the epithelium. We have the submucosa and the two sublayers of the Muscularis externa, and note that the body of the stomach can also contain a third oblique layer of muscle to help with the churning of chyme. Since the stomach is not bound to adjacent tissues, it contains a serosa, lined by mesothelium. This is the visceral peritoneum. The mucosa of the three stomach regions differs in several ways. First, the relative lengths of the gastric pits and glands changes, and the overall height of the mucosa differs. We will examine each region paying close attention to these two characteristics. But first, what is a pit and what is a gland? Changing abruptly at the esophageal-gastric junction, the mucosal surface of the stomach is now a simple columnar epithelium, and this epithelium now makes invaginations deeply into the lamina propria. The invaginations form millions of gastric pits, each of which opens to the stomach lumen as seen here in this cartoon in H&E stained section. The surface mucus cells that line the lumen and pits secrete a thick, adherent, and highly viscous mucus layer that is rich in bicarbonate ions. This is the gastric mucosal barrier. It protects the mucosa from the abrasive effects of the food bolus as well as the corrosive effects of stomach acid. The gastric pits lead to long branched tubular glands that extend through the full thickness of the lamina propria. These coil and fill most of the mucosa, as seen in this H&E stained section of the cardia. Around the glands are cells and capillaries and lymphatics of the lamina propria. Thus, the key here to identifying regions of the stomach are the pits and the glands. Let's look first at the cardia. The cardia is the smallest part of the stomach, and it has the shortest mucosal height and the shortest pits and the shortest glands. The glands are very simple, with almost all mucus cells in the epithelium. The cells are linked by tight junctions, and they secrete a viscous fluid that functions as that gastric mucosal barrier. The cardia closely resembles the pylorus histologically, which makes sense since both are essentially passages. The cardia functions to take in the bolus and pass it to the body and fundus, while the pylorus transfers the chyme to the duodenum, but the length of the glands and the length of the pits are different. The body, or the fundus, is the most histologically different of the three regions, and thus the easiest to recognize. In the body fundus, the gastric pits are quite short, while the glands are very long. Unlike the Cardia and Pylorus, the gastric or fundic glands in this region contain many different types of cells in the epithelium, and they have many different functions in digestion. These glands are often referred to as oxyntic glands, which means acid secreting, because they contain parietal cells that produce acid. Oxyntic can refer to both glands and to the cells. These H&E stained sections from our collection nicely illustrate the length of the fundic glands and give an overview of some of the different cell types found in the epithelium. Here you can see neck mucus cells and surface mucus cells, as well as the most recognizable gastric cell type, the parietal cell, and chief cells. We'll talk more about those cells in detail shortly. Finally, we reach the pylorus. This region looks histologically similar to the cardia, but has longer pits than any other region and relatively shorter glands, especially compared to the fundus. These pits are lined with mostly surface mucus cells. Here you can see the contrast between the fundus on the right and the pylorus on the left.
That's it for the three regions of the stomach. Now, there are a number of different cells in the gastric epithelium that perform critical functions in digestion, and I've not discussed them here, but we will explore these separately. For now, we'll move back to discussing the basic stomach plan with a brief look at the other layers. We continue with the other components of the mucosa, starting with the lamina propria. This H&E stained image shows the lamina propria, the loose connective tissue containing immune cells, blood vessels, and lymphatics. Below the lamina propria, you can see the smooth muscle of the muscularis mucosa.
The submucosa of the stomach consists of dense irregular connective tissue with larger vessels, nerves, and lymphatic aggregates, which are seen here, but can also be found in the lamina propria. The muscularis externa has two large smooth muscle layers, and in some regions, as mentioned before, will have a third obliquely oriented layer. In addition, here you can see an Auerbach's or myenteric plexus, and you can see the serosa with its mesothelial lining. Let's touch briefly on gastric movements. The first movement in the stomach is propulsion, where peristaltic waves move from the fundus to the pylorus, which is closed. Second, there are muscle movements primarily from those oblique layers that grind and mix the chyme closest to the pylorus. Finally, there is a movement called retropulsion, where as the pyloric sphincter opens slightly, a small amount of chyme enters the duodenum, but most of the chyme is forced backward into the body for more grinding. As discussed earlier, the mucosal barrier protects the epithelium from damage, and this barrier is physical and chemical. However, that barrier can break down and the mucosa can be attacked and damaged, resulting in an ulcer. By definition, a peptic ulcer occurs when there is a break in the mucosa of the stomach that penetrates through the muscularis mucosa. In other words, the break has to reach the submucosa. Once the submucosa is reached, since it contains larger blood vessels, ulcers can now have bleeding complications. One of the major factors in ulcer pathology is the presence or infection by H. pylori. Consequently, treatments to prevent H. pylori infection or antibiotics to control the bacteria are major treatments. Inhibition of acid secretion through the treatments we discussed previously is also important. Ulcers can ultimately progress to gastric adenocarcinoma, which is less common in North America, but is actually a huge problem worldwide. Here we see a gross specimen of gastric adenocarcinoma and a corresponding histological image. Note the loss of the epithelial glands on the side labeled abnormal mucosa.
We've now covered the basic plan, the regions, and overall functions of the stomach. There are a number of specialized cells in the gastric epithelium, and we'll discuss those in the next tutorial. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Thanks for stopping by.